Hi, Moadim L'Simcha. We're in the middle of Chol HaMoed Sukkot, and we're continuing with our next video. We'll continue where we left off, which was not to slaughter and collect the blood in a plate or into some sort of a depression in the ground, because that somehow was one of the things that believers in idol worship used to do, and therefore we don't do it. The next chapter in the Shulchan Aruch discusses which animals require Shechita. So let's just go through it. We know that the definition of a kosher mammal is an animal that has split hooves and chews its cud. And the truth is that it also has horns. Any animal that has horns is a kosher animal. So, for example, a giraffe actually has horns. Okay, so giraffe we also know is split hooves and chews its cud, is a kosher animal. Some people say, well, what about a rhinoceros, right? It has a horn. So the answer is a rhinoceros horn is actually not really a horn. It's really hair that's sort of spun into a point. But in any animal that you can think of that has a horn, a four-legged animal that is a kosher animal. So that is regard to animals. Regarding birds is where it gets a little bit complicated, because if you think about it, the Torah gives us 40 different types of birds that are not kosher. And theoretically, if we could identify each of those birds, we would say that anything else is kosher. The problem is that the Torah is a little bit unclear. It says, for example, v'atalef leminehu, which means, and the bat, which is a winged creature, and its kind. So what exactly does its kind mean? So the truth is that in the Mishnah, which is the precursor to the Talmud, it's the Jewish law in its most shortened and sort of tightly written state. The Mishnah tells us that there are 4 signs that would define a bird as being a kosher bird. Sign number 1 is that it's not an attacking bird, meaning it's not an eagle or in that family of a bird which is attacks and kills meat and so on, like those sorts of birds. The other thing is, once we know that it's not in that family of birds, it has to have 3 things. It has to have something called an etzba yetera, which when we translate it literally means an extra finger. It doesn't mean an extra finger, but if you look at a bird's foot, hold on, let me get you an example. Just stay there for a second. Okay, so what we have here is an example of a bird that's a kosher bird, and it's called a chogla in Hebrew. It's called perdix or perde in French. And if you look at its foot, you can see that it's got a long central toe. So some of the rabbis understand in etzba yetera this extra or this unique anatomical identifier as being this. Others say that it's, if you look here, there seems to be either an extra little toe in the back. You can sort of, let me see how I can show it to you. There you go. You can sort of see this extra little toe in the back. And some say that that's what it is. So that is identifier number 2. Identifier number 3 would be that it has a crop. What's a crop? Birds that are not meat eaters do the beginning digestion of their food in a little sack, a little pouch that is right here. Okay, and if you were to feed this bird or chickens or any other bird, if you were to feed them, let's say corn, initially it would swell up right over here because that's where that little crop is located. And only birds that are not meat eaters that eat sort of vegetables like our birds, kosher birds, have this crop. And finally, the last step on the digestive system is something that in Hebrew we call a Corkavan, which is the gizzard in English, they call it. And it is the last step on the digestive process. And anyone who's ever seen it, you cut it open, and it's usually full of the little bit of remainders of the food, and it has in it even rocks sometimes, because the rocks that the birds peck at and eat end up in there, and it's a very strong muscle, and what it does is it sort of grinds the remainder of the food. And when you cut it down the center, you can very clearly see that there's an internal whitish membrane. And in birds that are kosher birds, you can sort of peel that membrane off of the muscle with your finger or with a knife or something like that. But birds that are meat eaters, it's almost impossible, or is impossible, to peel that membrane off, and therefore it's not kosher in such a case. Now, here's the thing. Theoretically, if we were to use these signs, we could identify many birds that were probably kosher. However, it turns out that already in the time of the Talmud, there were birds that had similar names. And there was one case of two birds. One was considered to be a kosher bird, and one was considered to be an attacking bird, a non-kosher bird. And they had very similar names. And somehow there was a mix-up, and people thought that the non-kosher bird was a kosher bird. So already in the Talmud, we see that this was an issue. So close to a little more than 1,000 years ago, Rashi, the great commentator on the Talmud and the Torah and so on, Rashi said, therefore, as a result of this misunderstanding, we will only eat birds that we have a Jewish tradition on, that they're kosher. So, in a pre-industrial age where slaughter was done in each village, and there was a rabbi in each village who would take care of it, it was very easy for this rabbi to know what birds were available in that location. And if somebody went out and was a hunter and captured these wild birds, the local shochet would know, yeah, we have an ancient tradition that this bird is kosher. In the modern world, it's a little bit less common, because all slaughter has been done commercially for the last 70 or 80 years. So pretty much that means that a shochet could be working for 50 years, and he would only have seen those 2 or 3 birds that were brought to him that were commercially viable to grow and to slaughter, like a chicken, a duck, and a turkey, and what else? Maybe a goose, nothing more. This issue of tradition on which birds were kosher or not has been a very big deal in the rabbinic literature for the last 200 years, or more even. This is a book that was printed in Livorno, Italy in 1837, and in it is a picture, I'm going to show it to you, of all of the birds that this rabbi had a tradition on that were kosher. Hold on for a moment. I'm trying to find it here. Bear with me for a second. Here we go. So he actually had 30 birds that he had a tradition on. And number one, you can see, is a bird that we call the pheasant. We can't really so much identify each of these birds necessarily, although there is a list of the Latin names in the book. Number 3 is a quail. That's pretty easy to identify, and also the Latin name gives us that. Most interestingly is number 7. See that? Number 7 is a peacock. So they had a tradition that a peacock was a kosher bird. What we do see from this, and what's very interesting that we can see from this, is that each Jewish community had its own tradition on which animals were allowed to be slaughtered. Okay, so that's where it comes to birds. Next we come to fish, and fish, of course, only need fins and scales. And finally, the last thing is sort of an unusual thing, and that is what's called a kosher grasshopper, or a locust. And those locusts actually exist in Africa, mostly in the Sahara and sub-Saharan regions. I don't know if they exist on the western coast of Africa, but they certainly make their way, depending on weather conditions, to the eastern coast of Africa. Just last year or 2 years ago, there was a terrible plague in Ethiopia and in, I think, Sudan, and it made its way down to Kenya before those locusts made their way to Saudi Arabia and even a little bit to Israel. But what we see there's no need to slaughter those animals. Just rather they just have to be killed. There's no law that they have to be be slaughtered. Another law that you need to know, and that is that there is a general principle in Jewish law that anything that's found inside the animal is considered to be kosher. So therefore, if you slaughter an animal and you find inside of it a fetus, an unborn animal, that is considered to be a kosher animal, and it is obviously considered to be something that is meat. Okay? Let me just think. And I think that is all we have to worry about there. And, okay, the Torah says that we're not allowed to slaughter an animal until the 8th day of its life. Also there is a law that one is not allowed to kill an animal and its child on the same day. So since, generally speaking, we can't 100% be sure who the father was, but we can certainly be sure who the mother was. So unless we know for a fact who the father was, then, if there are multiple males around, we can't necessarily say that it's forbidden to slaughter the male and the child on the same day. But the mother and the child on the same day for sure. Generally speaking, the rabbi said that if you went into the marketplace and you bought, let's say, an animal, and we know that there was a baby, and somebody else bought the baby, you can assume that they're not going to be slaughtered on the same day, except for certain days of the year, like Erev Pesach, for example, or before holidays, or let's say a bride and a groom each bought either the mother or the child of this animal. So obviously they want to slaughter it on the day of their wedding, or have it slaughtered on the day of their wedding. So just know that these are laws that apply. We are going to be talking now about one more thing, and I think we'll probably end it with this, and that is, what about an animal that is ill? Now, it's very interesting to me that, especially given our experience and now knowledge after COVID about bird flu and all of these other issues that trouble the world, that birds are very potentially dangerous in that they can carry all sorts of viruses or diseases. So here we have a situation where the rabbi said, well, let's say we have an animal, either a four-legged animal or a bird, that's ill. And it's so ill that it's sort of laying down on the ground and, isn't even getting up, or isn't even running away from you or something like that. Now, especially in the ancient world where, every animal was so valuable. And even in our world, if you're a small farmer and you have, a few animals, and if one of these animals is sick, but it's still alive, your goal might be to try and slaughter it so that it remains kosher. So what's the definition of an animal that even though it's sick, you're allowed to cook it, you're allowed to slaughter it rather, is if it's a bird, as long as after you slaughtered the bird, there's some sort of an involuntary movement, right? Because normally when we slaughter a bird, or an animal for that matter, the body of the animal, even after the minutes, even after the animal lost consciousness completely, the animal's completely dead, you could chop the animal's head off by that point. The animal could still be moving around or jumping around or something like that. So as long as there was some sort of involuntary movement, that is considered to be healthy enough that it is still able to be eaten. One bit of advice that I will give you is that whenever you're touching birds or animals, you must wash your hands afterwards with soap and water, okay? Because we never know what viruses and what diseases will exist in those birds. And finally, even if there is a disease in the bird, if the bird is cooked to a sufficient temperature and completely, generally speaking, none of those diseases can harm us. So these are issues that we have to think about, and we're moving now in towards the more hands-on and the more practical aspects of the laws of Shechita.